frequent organizational dilemmas and problems that come to us in the world of design. And one of them is, oh, first of all, let's just a second. Oh, okay. Tell you what, we're running a little behind, so I'm gonna do this. We're looking at the design side, and I just realized this morning, too late, that I haven't given you any design sheets. But since we're still in the process of diagnosis, before we go, by next week I'll have some design sheets for you. Okay? All right. This is the design process. Now notice we're going in the opposite direction. For diagnosis, we went clockwise, looking at why. And here we're looking at stakeholder needs, and we're going counterclockwise. This is here, so what? What strategy do we need to have? So what? What processes and structure and leadership and systems do we need? Are there any viruses that might attack this particular set of design ideas that we're going to come up with? How do we implement it so the behaviors change? And then what results do we think will come out of those changed behaviors? So this was in the original article that you read on the models, but this just kind of put us where we are.
And I'd push back on that now, given what I just said about culture, and say not just what stakeholder needs and strategy, but taking into account what the limitations of.
Well, he's got the values and beliefs.
And that, I should have pointed that out. This is one of my big ahas as we've gone through diagnosis after diagnosis. People uncover these underlying values and beliefs that are contrary to what we need to be doing, and their question is, so how do you design for that? And so we've had conversations, say, okay, yeah, two inputs to strategy, what the stakeholders want, and what are the underlying values and beliefs. If we're aligned, great. If we're not aligned, we need to address that up front in our strategy before we ever go any further.
Really nice comeback. And what I'd argue is that the key underlying values and beliefs are motivational faith ones.
Absolutely.
Right? Where we were talking,
absolutely,
where Lisa was starting. But I'd also argue that the culture as behavior as skill is something to take into account. It takes a while to build those careers and those understandings and relationships. And so that's something beyond the underlying values and beliefs that I think is relevant.
Yeah. Okay. All right. We're going to skip that. We'll come back to that another time. Now we're going to enter into, Mark's taking you through strategy. We've worked on some of these before. We're going to work on processes a little bit today and on some collaborative structures. Two dilemmas. How do you get rid of bureaucracy? Second dilemma, how do you break down organizational silos? That's what we're going to work on today. Did the Fishers go through any of the buzzwords around bureaucracy with you in their team discussion? Okay. Basically, bureaucracy, when they first started doing production with machines, they tried to organize differently because it was a very different situation. And they organized people like they organized the machine. There's a central nervous system, there's a singular control unit, everything else is an appendage and just supposed to do a function. And that was the idea. So they broke jobs down to the smallest pieces, they standardized how it was done, there was only one control center, everything was run by policy, or for a machine it was the design specs. No duplication of functions, each wheel only did one thing, each sprocket only drove one wheel, each belt only drove one part of the system. Everything was broken down, no duplication. And then of course the physical was all that was paid attention to in terms of rewards. That's the bureaucracy. Most people complain about bureaucracy when they see that. You go into a store, you say, could you help me with this? And you hear them say, oh, that's not my department, you have to go over here. You know, I always cringe. You know, why can't we just can you help me here? So most people are not happy with the bureaucracy. They don't know what to do about it. So we're gonna debug bureaucracies now, and I'm going to give you a case study. The two case studies we have today are both actual client situations, principles around process design. Here we have a most generic process. We have something that's supplied, information or materials. Somebody does something to that, changes its form, that we call task one. It passes on. If there's been an error in task one, somebody fixes it, okay? If they need support, like IT or mechanical or whatever, those support units are there to help as needed. Then there's a decision made. Phase one is acceptable, now we move on. Somebody does something else to whatever it is. Somebody fixes that as necessary. They have support if they need it. Final decision, we now have the product or service or information that we wanted, and that's now then delivered to the client. Okay? Very, very generic. Now, I want you to think through with me what happens when we break a process into its smallest possible parts. So, for example, if we have one organizational unit is in charge of supplying the information or the raw materials, another organizational unit is in charge of starting the transformation process. What typically happens when those are done, those two steps are done by two different organizations? It could, depends on how quickly it needs to be done and how much, how complex it is, it could be. But don't look at each one, look at the interface between the two. What happens if this is two units? One group supplies it, the other group has to work with it. Emily.
Well, I think when you have that disconnect, then you might not really be getting the supplies that you need for the task, because you don't have the people doing the task pulling what is needed.
We get the stuff and we hand it off to you. The stuff, in our case, running a Pampers line, it wasn't running smoothly. We had a lot of rejects, we had errors, we had pieces of the web breaking and bringing the whole thing to a standstill. And we said, these materials are not in spec. The supply people said, we're doing the best we can. All we do is get it in and we pass it on to you. Okay? So there was tension here, right? I mean, and these people, what do they think of these people? Bunch of dopes. Okay? What do these people think of these people? Bunch of whiners, you know, prima donnas. If they think it's so easy, let them come and unload all these rail cars with all these large objects that have come from a factory, and we don't have the wherewithal to judge whether they're in spec or not. We don't know that. We're just doing what we can do, right? So now, what if you have one group that's responsible for the first task of transformation, and another group is supposed to check up on them and correct any errors? What might happen at that interface?
Probably something similar, I would guess, between supply and task and fix. It seems like you would have the fix guys.
How many times do we have to correct the same thing from you guys?
Right.
Why can't you get it right the first time? Well, if you think it's a barrel of Jell-O over here and real easy, well, you come over and try to do this, okay? So you have the same problem.
I appreciate her.
She already brought donuts.
Let me tell you, she had the whole priesthood group in our ward in stitches yesterday. She was looking for one person whose son was in the nursery causing problems. And she said, Carl. He said, he's leading music in primary. And Charlie goes, the whole room just erupted. But Charlie, what you see is what you get. All right. Okay, you're starting to get a picture here of what happens when we break a process up. I'm just going to jump ahead. The same thing happens. If the decision maker is separated from the rest, you get the ivory tower decision maker who's never satisfied with all the hard work that we've done. These people, how many times do I have to tell them this is not right yet? We've been through how many steps and it's still not right. And then, of course, if you have the support groups and you need IT support desperately, your computer's gone down, and IT says, make out a work ticket, take a number. We are swamped today. I don't know what's going on, but the systems are down and we got people all over. We'll get to you as soon as we can. Meanwhile, Lori is waiting and she can't do anything because her computer's down. So it's a real mess. So the more barriers you put in, the more difficult it becomes. And in bureaucracy, they put a barrier every step of the way. They break it down to its smallest possible piece. If there are enough of those elements in each step, you have a completely different department for each step. Okay? That's what gets bureaucracy going. That's what leads to our frustrations. Now, many years ago, a group of consultants in England in the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, they started experimenting and studying work process and work organization. And they developed a guideline, and this is a guideline. As you get into the companies you're going to be working with, they'll have very sophisticated quality technologies. Six Sigma, lean manufacturing are the latest ones. About every 8 or 9 years, there's a new framework, new material. It's all good stuff. But all of it is based on the principles that we're going to go through right now. It all comes down to a few basic principles. If you have these in your pocket, you can take any work process and do some really constructive work and analysis of it without knowing anything of the more sophisticated methods. Frankly, some of the more sophisticated methods have made it more complex and more bureaucratic than it needs to be. So anyway, that's my little caveat. So, first rule, draw the boundaries only where there is a tangible output or an actual change of state in the material or information. So, bureaucracy puts a boundary on each step of the process, and this one says only draw the boundaries where there is actually a tangible change. So, let's go back here. Where does the material or information, where does it first change its state, or where is there a tangible output first produced? We've got raw material, where does it first change? Task one. Okay, yeah. If it's information, we've now got a draft report. We've assembled the information into a reporting format. If it's for a child's stuffed toy, it's the batting, it's the fluff, and we sew something around it, whatever. All right. So that's a change. Now, where does that change next in this flow? Task two. All right. And according to that chain, when task two is finished, it's finished. Okay? So, as opposed to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 possible different steps or handoffs in the or departments in the first round, when you apply that rule, just look where the tangible outputs are. You can only justify at most 3 different groupings, right? So task one would also, the group that is responsible for task one would also be doing the fixing, the deciding, and there would be support resources just for that group to do what they needed to do. And then the same for the task two grouping. Okay, Emily?
So are you saying there would actually kind of be another boundary in support between support for task one and support for task two?
Well, notice I don't have the boundaries there, but you know, some groups, for example, they would have, if it's an IT group, for example, they might have people in their group that would be primarily assigned to task one and to task two. Okay? Sean?
So like these boundaries would be good times for like quality control to come in at those times to catch it. Maybe.
See, quality control in that flow, and this is what Dr. Deming advocated. Of all the quality gurus, Deming is the one that was the most solid in terms of principle, I believe. He said, you don't have a quality department. You have people who are doing the work who are able to monitor their own quality, and if they need some help, okay, you get some help to them, but you don't have a separate department. So this would literally be, let's say that this is information and this is one report that's coming out of it, then you rejuggle the numbers and you have a second report that comes out. You'd have the support that report one group needed would be assigned and available to them to be there as often as you need them, ideally. Okay? Now, if that means you need 3 people for task 1, you have 3 people. If you need 2 people for task 2, you have 2 people. If you need 24 people for task 1, if it's a lot of people and you need a lot of IT support, the staffing then goes with the workload that is being generated by that particular set of activities. Okay? All right? Without necessarily, well, they could still be in a different support group. Or the other thing is, these people eventually train some of these to do a lot of the IT troubleshooting. Okay? I once had an office in the old days that was in back of the photocopy room at the headquarters in Brussels. And de facto, I became the photocopy maintenance expert because I made my own copies, and when the thing jammed up on me, I read the instructions, and I fixed it up. After a while, the word got out, so when one of the other assistants would come in and they're running something off for the group vice president or the division VP, and it would jam up, and I was right there. Dave, could you help us for a minute? And I'd get out and we'd get the thing. That's about my only mechanical forte was in those days. So anyway, okay. So you see the difference. So instead of maybe 8 different functions, now we can only justify 3. Then the Tavistock people said, now of those three, challenge those. Which of those are absolutely essential? So, is the technology so complex in these three areas that one group could not cover all three? Okay? Now, depending on what it is, if it's a space shuttle that we're building, and these are all steps in producing a space shuttle craft, would one group be able to do the whole thing, do you think? Not hardly. If we are producing that stuffed toy with simple raw materials and a few things, could one group do all of that? Probably so. Okay, so is the technology so complex that it couldn't be brought into one? Are the units geographically separated? Okay, it's hard to have the sense of oneness when there is the physical separation. A challenge in our day, although the information technology and conferencing and webcams and everything are largely erasing that barrier even. So it's not absolute, but it's still a good point. Are the tasks on different time cycles? And this was a good one. There were two elements of this. One is, if it's a 24/7 operation, obviously one group would not cover 24/7. So you'd have to divide it up by time segments, all right, shifts. But another one is just as significant. Does one task require long-term view and working towards the long term, and does another task call for absolute daily, hourly adjustment and management and all that kind of stuff? What happens in your own life if you're trying to do something for the long term and you've got a lot of here and now issues screaming at you? Which one gets your time? The here and now stuff always does. So if this is market research, and this is a research group that's working on the cure for cancer, and this is a group that is delivering and managing a cancer treatment drug today in the marketplace, Tavistock folks would say those are two very different time cycles. Don't expect the same scientists to work on both at the same time. Okay, does that make sense? All right. So, very simple. Take the process. Find out where are there tangible outputs. Find out what the answers to these questions in your mind, and then put together the flow of the process. Okay? Now, we're going to work on a case study. This is
Dave.
sorry, question?
So the goal then is to...
Somebody describe the silo problem. The red boxes are people that need to collaborate on a business issue. And what would be some of the things that would get in our way of those people working together as needed?
Walls. Sheesh.
Those walls. So, bureaucracy again. This is our process thinking on a grander scale. All right, we've broken it up into logical units. We've got however many business units you want to have on the left side. And then you've got these very well-defined, focused, expertise-laden functions and sub-functions underneath those. Okay.
Is this matrixed, or is it just straight up? This is straight functional.
Well, this one is not matrixed. Okay. Actually, I'm going to give you a case with one like this, and you're going to get to put a matrix. Some of you, one group will get to put a matrix together for it. Okay. So. The barriers to getting those people around, there are political barriers, there are hierarchical barriers, there are priority barriers. I mean, if the general manager of Business Unit 1 says to HR, I need one of your talent management experts to come help us with a sales problem that we're having in Region 1, and we need the IT resources over here to help me, the talent management person and their hierarchy says, do you have any idea how many things we've got to deliver in the next 5 days? I mean, we are under the gun. So anyway, all those kind of problems. All right. A good friend of ours, Jay Galbraith. Alan knows him. I know him. One of the best minds in organization design through a lot of years. But he consistently comes up with new ideas as the world of organizational challenges change. Jay is usually at the forefront with some articles and some thinking on it, so he's very, very good. He put together his term for dealing with this collaboration problem is lateral capabilities. How do you get people to work across the lines, not just up and down, all right? And he's suggesting 5 things that you could do. Some are more easy, they're less complex, they're more natural in the way they could occur. Others are more complicated and need to be carefully designed. So one way you could get, these groups together is if you had periodically network meetings where different functions come together based on a topic, on a business priority, on the state of the business of a unit or whatever. The people come together, they get to know each other, and now I've got a contact, we need some IT help. Hey, I know this Lori person, and she could really do some stuff for us because she understands the world that we're living in. That kind of thing. So it can happen very naturally. Another one Jay calls lateral processes. Lateral processes is simply, if we're in different silos, 4 of us get together and we decide how we could work together on this project to help the general manager in Region 1. We just simply get together and we make it happen. Okay? And yeah, there may be political stuff, but we're skilled members of the organization. We know where the boundaries are, where the limits are, and we don't go over the edge, but we find a way to cooperate and get this thing done for our friend, the general manager. That's more natural, we just get together. Teams becomes a more structured approach. So if this is an ongoing issue, if this is something that's more important, then we might form a team. This is an example. I don't think I've showed this one to you before, have I? This was one of the business teams structures that we had at Procter & Gamble, where we had all the functions that were relevant to general manager. Notice they have resources. Excuse me. I'll send these slides to Alan and get them on to you. The gray petals, we call this the petal diagram. The gray petals are the resources inside the company that these representatives can deliver. These connections out here are external stakeholders whose support or help we might need. And so when, in this case, in this illustration, we've got, 8 team members that come together collectively in the room. They've got access to all the internal and external connections that might be needed to move, in this case, a business unit ahead. At P&G, we use this in Europe with 9 different countries trying to go to a Euro product. So we had, in addition to those 8 functions, some of them we doubled up on to make sure we had different countries also represented. So no country felt like they were being steamrolled by the rest of Europe. All right, so that's a team that gets the collaboration. Now, each of these people were matrixed back to their regular line boss somewhere either in a technical center in the headquarters in Europe or back to a country subsidiary headquarters. So they were all matrixed, but they came out of the stovepipes, out of the silos to form a team. And this team is now the engine that drives P&G worldwide. It's not any of the rest of the stuff. These teams are what drive the business ahead. Okay, let me go back here. Another one is integrated roles. This is a design choice. So here we have a situation, this is not totally fictional, but notice under research and development we have a research division that obviously does a lot of consumer research. And under our marketing department we have market research, which also is working a lot with consumer research. In some companies, those 2 groups don't share any data with each other. They don't like each other. There is rivalry. There is politics. There is all the reasons to hoard the information so that we have the blinding aha with the CEO and not that other group, the pretenders. Okay? I mean, that stuff goes on. So if you really needed to collaborate between those 2 research functions for the good of the business, with all those politics, and oh, by the way, this is usually just a lower version of the animosity and rivalry here at the upper level. So one way you might address that is these 2 groups pick ahead. These 2 groups report now to the same person. Market research, product research, they both report to the same person. What happens to the rivalry when that happens?
It's less intense at least.
It's amazing how quickly people will cooperate when they have a common boss who expects them to cooperate and share data. So that's an example of the integrated role. Now we'll go to matrix. I'm going to spend a little time on matrix, and then we're going to get you into a case working on these kinds of issues. So, here is, you recognize the matrix structure. Solid line denotes what? Direct reporting, meaning this person is your boss.
They sign the performance first.
Okay? Performance review and all that kind of stuff goes through the line. Pay is determined by the line. Assignments and specific day-to-day determined by the line. What are the dotted lines for our other groups?
Work relationships.
Work relationships.
Project reporting relationships, things like that.
Okay, there might be special projects. There might be, for example, in finance, we may have a new reporting system that finance coordinates and rolls out across all the business units. And so all of us that are in finance on these different business units, we now become the arms and legs for the new rollout of the finance system, or a new hiring process, or a new manufacturing standard, or whatever it might be. Okay? So, very important. Now, most people that have matrix organizations struggle a lot because they don't understand the basic rules of engagement. So let me walk us through this one pretty quickly. See if this makes sense to you. The business unit, the rule of engagement for the business unit. They're accountable for the business results. Okay? They have all of the interdependent functions. Now, if we're going to complete this, there's probably like twice as many of these functions here. But they have all the interdependent functions they need to be able to manage their business. This is kind of the cell at the highest level. Those functions should prioritize and execute what it takes to build the business for these different products. And hopefully, as they prioritize and execute, we end up thinking and acting as one. So we don't have divided loyalties, competing priorities, all that kind of stuff. Does that make sense? Okay? Now, what do the functions do? Functions are, if we're the HR person in RAL, the HR function, the corporate function, is responsible to make sure that you or I, we know our stuff. We are able to deliver the expertise that HR should be delivering to a business unit. We're able to do that. And if we need training or additional experience before we're put into that role, HR should be seeing to it that we can deliver the goods. Secondly, systems. If they're, like I was saying, if we have a new hiring system, we've got a new reporting system, whatever. If it's a system that is corporate-wide, the function drives that. One way of thinking about it, if you want to really get into some animation here, on these three areas, the functions have the solid line. Okay? For functional expertise, who calls the shots? HR should call the shots for us individually. Systems, the systems for HR driven across the company, those are driven by the HR. Career development of the people. What's next? What about our next assignment? That is managing the career development of an HR person or an IT person or a finance person. The career development is usually in the purview of the function. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yes.
All right. Now, in the last few years, we've had this regional thing. So here we've got Europe cutting into it. There are certain legal areas where they are different, area by area, country by country. Marketing approaches need to be different. What sells in one region may not sell in another. By the way, Procter & Gamble had only been in business in Japan for 29 years before it thought maybe for our television advertisements we should use Japanese actors in the native language rather than North American actors with subtitles. 29 years. Coincidentally, the business started to build and we changed our marketing to a regional approach. Okay? Product delivery, because of the distances involved, very often you'll have regional distribution centers, et cetera, et cetera. So those things are legitimate functions for a geography. All right? Any questions on that? Make sense? Simple rules of engagement. What do people complain about in the matrix? I got multiple bosses. I've got conflicting priorities. I don't know where to go, et cetera, et cetera. All because people do not observe the basic rules of engagement. So let's take an example. The CFO decides, because the company's got a continuing profit crisis, the CEO decides to send out a letter to all the general managers of the business units saying, we're not making enough progress in our profitability. I'd like each of you to develop for your business unit a list of immediate cost savings and total it up so that we can see where we're going to be coming out profitability-wise. Okay? Now, according to these rules of engagement, is that okay or not okay for the CFO to do?
No,
What's wrong, Bowden?
it's the business, general manager's probably, I would imagine, accountable to the CEO for business results, not to the CFO.
Okay? But the CFO is, responsible for financial performance, is trying to help, trying to encourage. Maybe they need a specific accountability to step up to the plate.
When he makes his pitch to the CEO, basically.
Okay. Okay. Good intention. What happens in most companies, because it's the CFO, nobody dares ignore something from the CFO. And so now they say, oh my gosh, in addition to all the other things we're trying to do in our division here, now we've got to develop this list of cost priorities because the CFO has asked for it. And that's when they complain about, I've got 2 bosses. Okay, you see how that happens. All right, let's go to another one. Let's say that, okay. Let's say Sean is the HR person for Pampers.
Oh, help them.
Okay? It's okay, Sean. I started at an early age at P&G. I was in Pampers when I started. All right. Okay. All right. So Sean is the Pampers HR person, and the general manager for Pampers loves Sean. He thinks HR is a bunch of kooks, but he's landed the gem of the bunch. And so he's going to be around for at least 10 years, and he would like Sean to stay as his HR person for those 10 years so that they can stay together and work and do his magic. Now, is that okay or not okay according to the rules of engagement?
That's fine.
It's fine with Sean.
Well, based on career development, that manager isn't in charge of his career development. But
Okay.
if Sean's happy with it and feels like it's an okay thing, then sure.
And if he is happy with that, then we would say, well, he wasn't really what we wanted anyway, so let him stay there. No. Sean, do you seriously want to do the same thing for 10 years? No. Is that in his best interest? Where's our next, where are our next senior level HR people for the company going to come from? And if they all stay in the business pocket for 10 years, what does that do eventually to the system of HR resources? That eventually, and Alan Wilkins in a different business unit wants somebody as good as Sean, but we don't have them because they're all locked up and nobody's moving. So, that's our
It's
point.
also not very good for the business, Pampers manager, because they're going to get one way of doing things and never have anyone really come in and look at it and look for improvements from a different perspective.
Right, right. So, you can see, according to the rules of engagement, but under those situations, if the things aren't clear and it's all political maneuvering, Sean says, I've got these 2 bosses, I've got these different priorities, what am I supposed to do? I don't want to alienate my boss because he's in charge of my pay. I don't want to alienate my HR leader because that's where my career might be if I ever get out of here. And so there we have it. Okay, so all of this is because people don't understand the rules of engagement and they don't abide by them. I can tell you in 16 years at P&G, I was in a matrix from day 1 till the day I left. And it was never the kinds of issues that I hear in other companies. Because P&G just learned how to make it work. And frankly, sometimes we learned how to ignore whether it was a dotted line or a solid line. We started to think, and that's the whole reason the matrix came in, think about the competing interest or the different interests, and you got to get some dialogue and figure out what is a sensible solution. P&Gers learned how to talk with the different constituencies, and somehow we came up with a solution that would work right. I was moved against the strong objections of my line bosses more than once. Okay? I stayed in a location longer than my functional leaders wanted me to stay because we weren't finished with what we had started. Well, all of that took place in a spirit of dialogue, looking at the different sides and finding a way that was reasonable and accepted by people. But that's not a common culture. Now, the other part is then, I'll skip. We'll just go with that. Okay. So here's the deal.
Do you need to have more cultural understandings in a matrix than you do?
Oh yeah, far more. Far more. It's, you know, in fact, and see, that's why Galbraith puts it at the top of the arrow in terms of the most complexity and the most time consuming. And frankly, there's some clients that want to go to a matrix, and I advise them not to, because they don't have the culture that would go for it. So here we have, now we're kind of zeroing in on, here's you or I in the matrix, and we've got the business unit, we got the function, and they're toing and froing, and we got the geography in there as well. The short term versus long term, the unique versus standard, the team versus the individual, those things that we just talked about. And by the way, Galbraith says, and I think this is very, very critical, he says, if one side always wins these debates, you do not have a matrix, in spite of what you call it. I don't care what you call it. If one side always wins, you don't have a matrix. So, what's missing and often not in the equation is whoever these three people report to, it needs to be the same person. So that if there's a problem, you can break the tie. You may need to be a tiebreaker. Okay. Matrix was developed in the aerospace industry because they needed these things. They needed more collaboration, dialogue, consensus, flexibility, moving in different ways, synergy. They don't work well in command and control cultures. Some of the medical organizations where, you know, the doctor is king or whatever, they have a real tough time with the matrix. Some organizations that draw heavily upon former military people have a tough time with the matrix because they're used to command and control. I have actually seen on a few rare occasions in church experience, because church is very much a matrix situation, because in the words of my old stake president, Jay Maliff, the whole church is staff. There's only one line in the church. Everybody else is staff. And some people in line positions don't achieve the spirit of Chris Bartlett, who, in my opinion, the real guru on international organizational issues. Let me just run this through. We're going to use a simplified version of this for the case that you're going to look at. And this is an example with Unilever. I like Unilever because it's like P&G. But Bartlett is addressing an issue here that most companies, if you look at their history, they've either centralized or decentralized. They expand internationally and they're local, then they go global. Then they have trouble with global, so they go back to local. And it just goes back and forth. And the problem is that very often everything is organized around one of these axes. So either everything is organized globally or everything is organized locally. You could substitute the words centralized for the upper axis, and you could have decentralized for the lower one. And so what this says, Chris is saying, you need to look at each business, each function, each task, and ask yourself, where is it on the continuum? So for example, in Unilever, a chemical business is more of a global business. It's more of a commodity business. The specifics around the regions of the world are non-existent, so it lends itself to a more global approach. Detergents, a little less so. Personal products, much less so, because there are different degrees of compatibility from the different markets. And then packaged foods, the tastes and interests are much more local in that. So if you try to treat any one of those businesses as a global business or a local business, you might be missing something in the equation. So he says, first of all, look at your businesses. Where do they shake out on this continuum? Then within each of those, we'll take detergents, each of those businesses, there are certain functions. And some of those functions lend themselves to a more global versus a more local focus. So you can see the obviously research and product development, more global, manufacturing, more regional, marketing and sales more local as you get into it. Okay? But even a more local marketing function, some of those tasks might be more global, like product policy, like advertising in general. But pricing, distribution, and promotion would be much more local. And they should be recognized as such and organized around that framework. Okay? Now, is that sufficiently confusing? Questions?